Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Kia ora, I'm Zoe George and welcome to the November episode of Fair Play, a podcast covering women in sport from athletes and results to current affairs and issues. This podcast is made in association with Wisp Sports, Locker Room and RNZ. If you're into podcasts as much as we are, check out RNZ for politics, crime and lifestyle podcasts. And if you want your sports injection, check out Wisp Sports and Locker Room for everything to do with women in sport. This month, we focus on leadership, leaning in and quotas in sport with Karen Skinner, New Zealand Rugby's Head of Respect and Inclusion, President of New Zealand Football Johanna Wood, former Cricket Wellington Board Chair Sally Morrison, and Jan Dawson, President of Yachting New Zealand. And of course, it's not fair play without an update on the toilets at the Basin Reserve. Today's co-host is another familiar voice to Fair Play listeners. She's one of New Zealand's leading sports academics, looking at issues from media representation to youth physical culture. She's also researched sports fandom and has recently undertaken research around the most recent Men's Rugby World Cup. Professor Toni Bruce, kia ora.
Kia ora to you too.
Lovely having you in the studio. What have you been up to?
This week, mostly marking exams, but longer term, I'm doing a lot of work with my colleague Margaret Henley and Netball New Zealand to try to understand netball fans, because there's very little research on women sports fans anyway, and there's almost nothing on women who are fans of women's sports. So that's been a really exciting 3-year project that we're starting to pull all the findings together. Ooh. And I've just finished my 4th cycle of research on what Rugby World Cups mean to New Zealanders.
Wow. Let's talk about the netball first. Why is it that female fans haven't really been researched?
I think it's the whole issue that sport's associated with men and masculinity, and which pervades everything in sport, including many of the issues we're going to be talking about today. So, and I think when you start to move to look at women fans of women's sport, that's like the most marginalised area completely in the research realm, as we've discovered.
Wow.
So it's been quite interesting. And what's interesting to us is that netball fans are different from many other kinds of sports fans. So, for example, if you go to a netball game, they do have alcohol available, but virtually nobody drinks. So it's not... People go there because they love netball, they understand netball, they're passionate about it. They don't necessarily go for some kind of party atmosphere. So it's been really interesting talking to netball fans about why they come, what they get out of netball, and we're starting to find some really interesting differences between them and what you might call average sports fans, I guess.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because there is actually a culture around alcohol and sport. So it's interesting that netball fans are just there purely for the game.
Yeah, and we can tell that because when the game's underway, everyone's focused on the game. And the oohs and the ahs and the sort of physical responses are really, really tied to what's happening on the court. So it's really obvious that most of the fans that are there really understand what's going on.
That's so cool. And you've just done your research into Men's Rugby World Cup that New Zealand came 3rd in. And normally we don't talk about men's rugby, but women watch rugby and watch the All Blacks as well. So what did you discover?
The survey that I do is self-selecting, so it's definitely not nationally representative or anything, but I've been doing it for 4 iterations. And one thing that really stood out this year was that it didn't matter to people so much whether the All Blacks won or not. And so I started to look to see if there were any gender differences in how people felt about the Rugby World Cup, how important it was to them. And actually, surprisingly, there isn't much difference. We've got absolutely passionate women and passionate men at one end of the spectrum, and we've got absolutely passionate rugby haters who are men and who are women at the other end. It was really interesting. I was kind of expecting to find some gender differences, but the ones that are there seem to be quite subtle.
That's interesting. Recently, New Zealand On Air released their cultural identity research that they've undertaken, and it said that more than 70% of New Zealanders feel that our cultural identity is attached to our sport.
That's actually backed up by international research. So there was an international study done in the early 90s, and I haven't seen an update since then. But they asked people all around the world what made them feel like people of that nation or proud to be people of that nation. And New Zealand was first equal with Ireland in terms of putting sport as the number one.
Really?
So, yeah, it's been a space where we've been able to shine on the world stage, and we've been doing it from very early on, even before we were an independent country. So there is something about sport and our incredible success, given the size of the country, that allows us to feel proud, like we've got something to offer the world. So it doesn't surprise me that came out.
Professor Toni Bruce is our co-host today. Did you discover whether rugby has completely oversaturated the market?
Over the last few years, the last couple of Rugby World Cup iterations of the study, that's been a theme that's coming through, that there's just too much rugby. There's too many layers of rugby. And one of the questions I ask is how much do you think other New Zealanders are interested in the All Blacks, the Rugby World Cup and rugby? And the All Blacks come out on top, and I think that's connected back to nationalism. Rugby World Cups come out second, around 70 in the 70%, and the estimate of people's interest in rugby is usually around 50. So there is definitely a sense that rugby as a sport is not as important as it used to be, but the All Blacks still really matter.
And I guess that's something to do with culture as well. We will hear from Karen Skinner from New Zealand Rugby shortly, but there's been massive cultural change within rugby over the last 2 years, which has been more inclusive, more respectful, and it's, for me, I really like that. It makes me go, yep, I want to be involved with rugby because of that.
Yeah, and certainly in the comments that people make on the survey, there's been quite a lot of people saying that they appreciate that the All Blacks are good ambassadors for the country 90% of the time.
They're only human.
Exactly. We're all human, but when they act in shall we say, ways that we don't find totally acceptable, it just happens absolutely on a world stage. So I kind of, and also just the level of interest in the Black Ferns and how that's growing, and in the women's sevens. I hope to see that eventually people will say, yes, the All Blacks make me feel proud to be a New Zealander, but also the Black Ferns make me feel proud to be a New Zealander. And we're starting to see that happen in terms of television ratings and interest and all that kind of stuff. So I feel like things are going forward in the right direction.
So today's main topic is about leadership in sport. What does it look like, and what does it take to rise to the top of sporting organisations? Shortly we'll hear from 3 very interesting individuals. But first, Toni, why is there an underrepresentation of women in leadership positions in sport?
Well, it's not my main area of expertise, but I think the overall culture of organisation plays an enormous role. So there's been this sort of somewhat naive belief that if we just add women and stir, things will change. But we know that doesn't work.
It's not true.
No, it's not true. And it happens right across sport. It's sports media, sports organisations. We know that if the taken for granted assumptions, practices and things are designed for and by men, and if gender isn't really on the agenda, then women can enter in often, but they tend not to stay long.
And how do our experiences differ from men who participate in sport and leadership? I know that's a very wide-ranging question.
That is a very wide-ranging question. Well, one of the things is that most, women tend to be responsible for childcare and child rearing and things like that. And so evidence on household labour and all kinds of research shows that women actually have in some ways more responsibilities than men, although I think that's changing a bit. So organisations that have been designed for men, like things like meetings, just things like, is there a toilet where a person who's on a board who's a mother can actually bring her child and do nappy changes in a safe and clean environment? Those kinds of things just... When gender's not on the agenda, people don't even think about that. So it becomes yet another barrier to women going, this is just too hard, or the meetings are held at a bad time. If there was an easy answer, we would have solved it. So I just think there's multiple layers at which change has to happen. And that's where I think the New Zealand Rugby respect and responsibility thing is a really powerful example of what we should be doing, because they're looking at the whole organisation, top to bottom, practices, all kinds of things to try to make a whole culture change. And I have a feeling that's what needs to happen in order for real change to happen.
Well, that culture change was part of the discussions that I went to earlier this month, which were hosted by Women on Boards New Zealand. They hosted a Women in Sports Governance session asking if there's a current crisis in this space. There were 4 sessions across the country, and I was fortunate enough to attend the Wellington panel where quotas, unconscious bias and creating encouraging environments were discussed. The keynote speaker was Karen Skinner, New Zealand Rugby's Head of Respect and Inclusion. She's been overseeing that cultural change and diversity program at the national sporting body, which aims to change the wider culture within the sport. This initiative was introduced after a panel was established to address the 2017 incident involving a Chiefs rugby team and their mistreatment of a stripper at an end-of-season function. Since then, though, New Zealand Rugby is engaging with more women than ever before, and there has been a move to change the culture, not just from the top down, but from the clubrooms up. I started by asking Karen about the work New Zealand Rugby has been doing around respect and responsibility.
Well, I think the Respect and Responsibility review that came out in 2017 was a blueprint for change for rugby. It showed that there were lots of areas that we were doing really well and then areas that we needed to change. And so the last couple of years have been working with our stakeholders across all of different parts of rugby to implement that report really, and to make sure that we are really intentional in our culture and are welcoming lots of people to our game.
How do we change that culture though?
For us, we've done a range of things that I think are helping to shift the culture. We have created a really clear charter called the Rugby Way, and through that we're having lots of conversations about what we need to do to make sure that we have a really welcoming culture where people can be their best, where we're passionate and where we're playing fair. And when you really focus on that conversation, I think people who are responsible for the different environments across rugby really start to look at what can be done. And so we're seeing, lots of great people across the country championing, culture change. I think, as we've talked about this morning, sport, including rugby, faces a lot of change and a lot of challenge. And I also think making sure that we have a really welcoming culture where everyone can thrive is part of making sure we can really address those challenges and embrace the future.
That cultural change is not just coming from the top down, but also from the grassroots up, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the world in which we live is changing, and therefore all of the institutions, including sport institutions and rugby, have to change with it. So we're seeing, from the chair of our board, our CEO across the country, our provincial union leadership, club leadership, we're seeing lots of people lean into the change that I think's needed. And both looking at what's great about rugby and what we want to hold on to, because you obviously have to do that first, and then where are the things where we need to be a bit more intentional and make sure we are making that change.
Regarding the Respect and Responsibility panel and a review, has that become best practice now, do you think, for all sports bodies, or should it become best practice for all sports bodies?
That's an interesting question. So the Respect and Responsibility review, I think, is a really breaking piece of work. I don't know many sports organisations that have done such a comprehensive review, both in the kind of high performance environment and in the community environment. And so I think, we're in a really privileged position having that report, and we certainly want to be able to kind of share that with other sports here and around the world, because I think it's been a good opportunity. And I think what rugby is doing is embracing an overall program that's really embedded in our strategy, rather than just having a few isolated programs. And I think that's what's really leading to our success.
Quotas. It's been a hot topic. Do we need them, and do they work?
Ensuring that we have more diversity of thought, diversity of skill, demographic diversity on boards is a really important part of our change program. and we've been working on ensuring we get more diversity, in particular gender on boards, and I think that's really important. Obviously, the government through Sport NZ has set the 40% target, and so that's really putting up pressure on sports to make sure we're moving fast enough. Yeah. So I think at the moment we're seeing some really great progress in rugby, and lots of people around the country embracing the kind of the call for diversity, or the way that diversity can help us address our challenges. But I think the research around the world shows that there are points in time where you do have to start setting some numbers, and so I think Sport NZ's kind of led on that. It's not necessarily a rugby quota, but we'll certainly be looking at how we can be reaching that.
I'm going to let you go shortly because it's a busy day, but you talked about sport in a number of different facets, commercialisation, entertainment, and the fact that actually when it comes to the decision making of spending, it's about 80% women who make that decision worldwide. There is a financial benefit for sport to engage with women, isn't there?
Yeah. So I think when, you look at the role that women play, as you say, they contribute to a lot of spending decisions in households. They still, are a big driver of what their children are doing, the time allocation. So I think there's lots of really significant reasons why we need to ensure that there's a woman's voice at that governance level, because they are so influential in the decisions that are impacting our sport, absolutely.
That was Karen Skinner, Head of New Zealand Rugby's Respect and Inclusion. Today's co-host is sports academic Professor Toni Bruce. Toni, from a sociological level, how do we change that culture that surrounds sport?
That's the $1 million question. If we could answer that, everything would be lovely.
Yes.
I think we can look to countries and organisations that have done this successfully already. And as we heard from Karen, rugby's really trying to embed it throughout the organisation, and that's a really positive step. And I think in some ways in New Zealand, because of rugby's status, as our national sport, I think it could provide a blueprint for others. So if people see rugby doing it successfully, then other codes that might be a bit recalcitrant or unwilling or unsure about whether this is truly necessary, they're likely to get on board. So I think that's part of it.
Following Karen's keynote address, she was joined by several other influential women in sport. Among them was President of New Zealand Football, Johanna Wood. She's the first woman to hold that role. She moved into sports governance following a career as a secondary school principal. These days, she's one of only a few women who sit around the FIFA table, helping make big decisions that affect the sport globally. I sat down with her following the panel and started by asking her about her pathway to the top.
Well, actually, it's interesting because President Infantino of FIFA asked me that when I was elected to the council, and how was I involved in football. And my father was a footballer. He used to play at Petone Club here. I grew up in Upper Hutt, so I grew up on the sideline. All right, never played because as we were growing up, my sister and I talked about this the other day, football was not an option for us. You could play netball or hockey, but you could not play football. So when my children came along, I got involved in the management and of the teams. Out of that, I was asked to manage a men's first team, and I'm going, are you for real? But yes, I did. And I was then went on to be president of a local sporting club, and then I became, it's a bit confused, there's sort of two pathways, because I went through education, I chaired the Sport Fit Management Committee. And if there was an issue with a sporting code, you used to go along and talk to the sporting code. So we had an issue with football. I went along to a meeting for Central Football and New Zealand Football, asked some difficult questions and got shoulder tap. And as they say, the rest is history. So club pathway, federation pathway, and chair of a federation for 8 years, and then people asking me to stand for New Zealand football. And I went, oh yes, I'm nearly finished my doctorate. Okay, I'll give it a go.
How do we challenge the status quo without causing too many ripples?
I think you have to be really good listeners. You have to have pretty high EQ to actually get a sense of what's going on. And you have to respect everybody's position because everyone looks at the world from their worldview. So from their perspective, they're not wrong. You have to perhaps present them with some evidence which challenges that perception as not being the one that we should be working with in the world in general.
It's about challenging ideas though, right?
Absolutely.
Rather than the person.
That's right. It's challenging the ideas. So you're challenging their perception that it's okay to only have men, for example, in governance roles.
What's been your role regarding the gender pay gap and closing that at football?
For the players, they already have pay parity. They've had that now for nearly 18 months. So we've got that. Have we got pay parity amongst staff? I think that's probably a bit of work that we need to look at. But from what I've seen, if you are in a role, doesn't matter whether you're male or female, you will get the same pay.
That's the way it should be, right?
Absolutely.
And it must be very interesting seeing what's been happening in Australia the last couple of weeks around their pay.
Yes, seem to have made a bit of a few steps, so that's really positive. I was interviewed by Sarah Gregorius when I was first appointed, and Sarah said to me, where do you think things are for New Zealand football? We know we had the crisis last year, which came out of the Ferns, but we widened that to a much bigger scope as football in general. So I think in some ways New Zealand set the way for some of the other member associations to start asking some questions.
You're sitting on international around the table as well with FIFA, but I think you said a few interesting stats earlier. What were they? Can you remind me?
Okay, so I'm the first New Zealand president, female. I'm the first female to sit around the Oceania executive table, so that Oceania Confederation has 11 member associations. If I was the female council member and not a president, I wouldn't get any voting rights around that table. Because I'm a president and a council member, I do. So there is a bit of work to do around some of the rules in that respect. And I'm one of 6 females out of 37 around the FIFA council table. So it works out about 16%. It is a quota that FIFA have brought in.
And is that the quote, 16%, is that the quota? Or
well, no, it's one female per confederation.
Okay.
And I'm only one of 211 presidents of member associations currently. Someone said to me the other day, actually the Daily Telegraph, how could you increase that number? I think you've got to look at your own member association, increase the number of women at that, then there would be more women who would be available to stand for some of those other council roles.
Yes, quotas are an interest, but something we've been talking about today. But long term, are they sustainable?
No, I don't think so. I think they're part of the solution going forward. And I mean, in our discussions this morning, you would have heard there's multiple solutions. So you've got to keep looking at what's right for now. Is this fit for purpose for now? And at the moment, it is fit for purpose. We've had X number of years where we could have had women on boards. We didn't. So we need to get people fit for purpose and check the rules, fit for purpose. So I think, have you seen that show, That Bloody Woman?
Yeah, yes, I have.
You know, like if you watch that story,
yeah.
like you don't have to be radical, you have to be smart to make changes.
Be smart. I'm going to let you go shortly, but can we talk about toilets just for 2 seconds?
Okay.
There's been, this is a growing discussion about creating facilities that will bring in more participation, more women. If you build it, they will come. How's it going in football?
Look, we'd have a number of changing sheds that would only be catered for men. The toilets aren't conducive for women for changing, so there needs to be a lot more work done in that space. But it's not just toilets, Zoe, because it's also about accessibility for those with disabilities to watch the game. In terms of FIFA, they have some requirements if you host a World Cup where you have to have make the game accessible. So there are some changes afoot, but you have to you need to look at what's happening in your own space first of all.
Well, you came across this recently as well, the inequality of toilets. You were somewhere and there was only 2 toilets for women.
Yes, I sit on a local trust for one of our communities that I live in, and it's a venue. It can have up to 600 people in it.
Wow.
And it had 2 female toilets. So we've actually just completed a project where we've installed a whole more lot of toilets. So there's not a queue now for the ladies' toilets.
New Zealand Football President Johanna Wood. And of course, we had to talk about toilets. Don't worry, we'll talk more about them later in the show. Today's co-host is academic Toni Bruce. Toni, Johanna spoke about quotas. Have you ever looked at research into quotas?
Well, there's a couple of things I think I could add in terms of the idea of quotas. One is that culture change is partly related to numbers. And I remember reading some American psychology report back in the 1970s, I think, that was discussing how you need at least 15% of an organisation to be of a certain group for that group to be seen as a normal part of the organisation. And we also know that being the only person, the one who's often expected to speak for that group, it's not fair and nor is it sustainable. So there is this sense that we have to have sufficient numbers and also sufficient allies and people on board who understand why it's important for it to change. So I had a chat with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation exec Nancy Lee last year. And she said something that really stuck with me, and that was, she was talking about sports media, but I think it applies to sport generally. She estimated that about 15% of people in the field get gender equality and they understand why it's important. She felt like about 60% were trying to get it, but they either didn't really understand what the issue is or they were kind of oblivious to it, so they just don't even think about it. And there are about a quarter who don't get it, don't care to get it, or are actively working against gender equality. And unfortunately, some of them are in powerful positions. But if she's right, we've got 75% of people in sport who do understand or are willing to learn. And if we can get all those people on board, then I think we'll see some real and lasting change.
Allies. So how do we engage with those people, do you think?
That's another $1 million question. I think this is where I think quotas might have a role to play. I don't think they're the be-all and end-all, but in Norway, for example, they put in a requirement that 40% of all sports boards must be women, right across the whole sports sector. And there was some initial resistance to that, but as it became normal and kind of normalised, and because there was more than one token woman, there was actually quite significant changes in how boards operated, the kinds of opportunities that sports organisations were offering. So I think they're quite a successful example of how things can work. And once we get that change, often then we don't actually need the quotas. But there does have to be, I think, some kind of carrot or stick to actually get the whole process started.
I guess it's not just about getting women on boards, it's about wider diversity as well, isn't it? So how do we make our sports boards and our sports bodies more diverse?
It's actually making sure that boards reflect the diversity of the people who play that sport or are participating in that sport. We really don't want to replace the pale male and stale boards with pale female and stale boards. So we need ethnic diversity, we need socioeconomic diversity, we need youth voices on boards. If the people running sport are going to do a job, especially now because, there's so much pressure on sports organisations with numbers dropping and all that kind of thing, if they don't get people on the board or voices around the board table that actually represent those who are involved in the sport, then that's not really going to take us very far forward.
Today's co-host is academic Toni Bruce. We continue our countdown to the Cricket World Cup 2021, which is being held here in New Zealand. Over the past few months, we've talked to women who will play a role in this, from journalists to decision makers. Today's profile is of a woman who's been creating a path for others in domestic cricket. Sally Morrison was the first elected female chair of Cricket Wellington board. She recently stepped down after serving 9 years. Cricket is in her blood, so it seemed natural to pursue a career in sports governance. I started by asking Sally what her biggest achievement was while sitting on the board.
What I have loved so much, particularly about my time as chair, is how our CEO, Cam Mitchell, and our board has taken a really purposeful view of what equality looks like. Now, we can't control how much we pay our women players, which is the lever that we've talked about today, but what we can do is control how we treat women in our system. And tomorrow there is a function to unveil the honours board for our women players. So our home change room in the Basin Reserve has a specific women's change room. So that traditionally men talk about their name on the wall and the honours board. Well, we have that for women now, and how ridiculous that we didn't have it previously, but you need to fill these gaps and make it real. And so our women are treated equitably. We have a high percentage of our staff are women. When I was on the board, we have 5 women and 2 men. And whilst that sounds like we certainly had a gender problem because we didn't have enough men, it was because women wanted to be on the board. And I was so excited about that. And these aren't just any people coming in off the street. There's a Rhodes Scholar, QSM for Services to Community. Gretchen is a phenomenal woman in terms of her law degree and her work with Sport New Zealand, her associate in terms of leadership training. These are amazing women. And so I think that what we have created at Cricket Wellington is an environment where everybody feels like they can add as much value as they bring in the sport, the high performance, the community level. This year, Cricket Wellington is not charging women to play cricket.
Are you serious?
I'm serious. And so if you want, and the club may make a different choice, but the Cricket Wellington is not charging an affiliation fee for any women to play cricket this season.
What's the reasoning behind that?
We want more women in the sport. And because we have a strong view at Cricket Wellington that women are one of our greatest opportunities from a cricket perspective because of the small participation numbers right now.
Well, that's it. I think 90% of girls and young women who play cricket up until the age of about 17 then drop off and stop playing altogether.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm part of that statistic.
Are you really? I'm so sorry. Cricket's so much fun.
Well, I am involved with cricket in other ways, but just like you. But you're right, it is a fun game. I was talking to Karen from New Zealand Rugby before about the financial benefit of engaging with women in sport. And so what are you seeing in regards to that? Are we attracting more women in our crowds and our audiences when it comes to cricket?
Absolutely we are, and we talked about the percentage of discretional spend, so between 70 and 80%, and the statistic I had read is 85% of discretional spend decisions are made by females, and if that's the choice to buy a stadium ticket or a membership or a hat, or in fact that little Johnny or Jenny is going to play cricket on a Saturday morning, then those decisions are largely made by women. And so if we want our sport to thrive and survive, then it's about being inclusive of the ideas of women. In fact, it's more than that. Why do I even have to say women at all? Is to be welcoming to everybody's views and actually the economic imperative, as you point out yourself, as women, because they make those decisions. Let's not split straws about that. I'm not sure why we have these myths in our society about anything else from an economic perspective.
We're talking with Sally Morrison. During the panel discussion that we've had, you talked about value and women's value. So how do we believe in what we can bring to the table and to our sport?
It's a really good question, and I think it's one that women struggle with themselves. I'm not sure why. One of the things I said to the audience was, we need to talk about she, the surgeon, she, the chair, she, the director, she, the firefighter, she, the police officer, she. And we don't necessarily do that. So as a society, I think we expect to see men in these roles. That in no way is putting down males. It's actually saying we need to lift up women because women have a huge amount to contribute. And if you look at the statistics at a macro level in terms of international influence of women leading communities, we know that there are better outcomes for communities when women are in leadership positions. We also know that if a girl or a woman has been involved in participation in sport, there's a 79% more chance that she'll be a leader in our community. And so the whole world goes round in a more positive way if we think and follow those statistics. So what are we doing about that? Well, we need to think about putting women in positions of leadership when it comes to governance.
At the moment, there is a massive push from the government. They've kind of set this 40% quota for women on boards. Cricket is slowly getting there. I think they're going to make it. But there's more women on boards now on cricket boards than there has been ever before in the past.
Absolutely.
But how do we change the culture around that? We talk about men's sport being an established business and women's sport being a startup. So how do we push that and encourage that to thrive, both in a governance level and in a sports level?
Yeah, you know what? It's the question of our ages, isn't it? And it's such a hard one. I think, though, we have to bust some popular myths about, people don't watch women's sport. Well, they do. And we can look at the TV viewership for last year with the cricket. I was lucky enough to be able to see the Sky Sport figures, and the most watched domestic cricket game last year was a women's cricket game on the 6th of January. Now, we didn't talk too much about that, but goodness gracious, why did we not talk about it, I wonder? Because it does bust some of those myths. And if we think that way and say, well, there's the opportunity from a commercial perspective, wouldn't we do some things differently? Well, we would. So doesn't it start with busting the myth in the first place? And I think the American women's football team is a phenomenal living example of this, that they, until the court action, or long drawn-out legal action, in fact you should call it, were paid significantly less than their male colleagues, despite the fact their male colleagues had less of a TV audience, less of a commercial revenue from merchandise, or even anything associated with their brand. They were paid more in a wage and salary perspective. Why?
interesting, isn't it?
It really is.
I think that it's pay parity is a huge issue in sport, and it's I know that it's something that both the ICC and New Zealand Cricket have said that they want to close, but they haven't kind of given any dates and when they want to close. Speaking of the ICC, New Zealand's hosting the ICC World Cup 2021. What role do major associations and MA boards play in preparing their grounds and facilities for that event?
Well, it's so exciting, isn't it, to have the World Cup in New Zealand? Gosh, that's great. We've met with Andrea, the CEO of the event, and look, she's doing a fantastic job, and it's really exciting. The MAs and what have you, I mean, they contribute at a very practical level with regard to hosting. It's quite tricky with an ICC event because it's clean stadia, so there's a couple of technicalities there. I think, though, we need to embrace it. I'm really sick of the tokenism of the idea of, it's a woman's thing, it's a woman's that. Actually, it's a World Cup on our shores, and we'll have a New Zealand team competing in it. Let's embrace that, New Zealand. It's going to be fantastic. And I think if you looked at the last Women's World Cup in the UK, it was a brilliant event. It smashed expectations. I think there was a 92% increase in social media interest from India. But you know what? All they did was open the door and let people in. And people looked in the door and said, yeah, I want to be part of that. So I just think comes back to my last question. We just need to change the way we think about these things and bust some of these myths. And I'm not entirely sure how that will happen, but I think it's absolutely imperative that it does.
And before I let you go, because I know you're super busy, but can we talk about toilets for 2 seconds at the Basin? Stop. I'm sorry. I can't help it. I'm sorry. How do we make our sports grounds and facilities more inclusive?
I think that's a really good question, and I think we answered it today. We put more women on boards and into decision making, because I think a lot, and it may sound like today was a bit of a beat up on men, but it's not. It's not. It's about challenging a system that doesn't give a voice to women. And I think when we do give voices to women, these things will change by necessity, because a woman will say, well, have you thought about this? And in actual fact, the table, I don't ever start with a malicious intent. They just didn't realise that. So I think, to your strongly made point, we need to change the way we think about things, and putting women around decision-making tables is part of that. I think this journey is about our society accepting and understanding and then supporting the idea that women have a voice and that it's important. I have 4 daughters, and so I'm biased, but we need a world where our sons and our daughters understand themselves to contribute the value that they have, and that shouldn't be decided by society but by them.
Former Cricket Wellington board chair Sally Morrison. I loved her energy, co-host Toni Bruce. She is infectious.
Yeah, I totally agree. And we need that kind of enthusiasm and energy, because there is something about positivity that actually enhances the possibility for change. Now, if we're always banging on about how terrible everything is, then that tends to put people on the back foot. So I think in some ways, if we're really looking for change, one way to do it is to really focus on positivity. This is what I'm doing actually in my own research at the moment. Instead of banging on about how the media doesn't cover women's sport, I've been really talking to people who are making change, like Suzanne McFadden of Locker Room, for example, or Mel Robinson, and trying to focus on the spaces where really good things are happening, because I think if you show people, look how fantastic this is, then there's a kind of energy that comes with that might bring people along for the ride.
It is very interesting looking at sport media, and it's a topic that I'm sure the two of us could talk about for hours. But in that sports newsroom, predominantly, again, men. Yes, men's sport are covered. Women's voices are starting to come through, but, not at the rate that I was kind of expecting. It is 2019 after all, but...
Yeah, I remember I was the first women's sports reporter for the Otago Daily Times back in the day, and it was so weird because I just thought this is perfectly normal. I've been a journalist, now I'm doing sport, that's great. And they walked me around the newsroom and introduced me to everyone and kept saying, this is Toni Bruce, she's the first women's sports reporter in the 100 and whatever year history of the ODT. And I'm like thinking, how do I respond to that? I'm just like, hi. And they replaced me with a guy.
Right.
So
of course they did.
But again, it's that sense that, and in fact, we did a survey in 2007, and I think it was only 7% of women in newspaper newsrooms in sport were women. And so, again, it's that sense that if you're the only one, it's about a sense of comfort, about a sense of acceptance. So women will go into those roles, but you have to be quite thick-skinned to stick it out, I think.
Co-host Toni Bruce, Sally Morrison talked about value and the value we place on ourselves. But that's easier said than done, isn't it?
It is, and I think a lot of it has to do with like societal expectations. So if you're looking out there and you're only seeing men or white men in charge of sport, then you don't necessarily see a place for yourself. And if you know you're going to go in and it's going to be a fight and you're going to have to carry the world on your shoulders, many women are too sensible to do that. And so they will go and put their energy somewhere else. So I think we need to have people who are in women's corner, who are going to support them, encourage them, mentor them, shoulder tap them for opportunities, because women do tend to be less likely to put themselves forward for opportunities. They want to make sure that they really know how to do something, whereas there is research that shows that men, if they can do a bit of it, they think, oh yeah, I'll give it a go. So there is that. It's a bit harder, I think, for women to take that step and really put themselves out there.
Well, the saying goes, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Moving on, there's 3 World Sailing Champs happening in Auckland at the moment, and there's a big push by the IOC to get more women involved with the sport. One woman leading the way is Jan Dawson. Not only is she a successful businesswoman, having worked with the likes of AIG, Westpac, KPMG and Meridian Energy, she also sits on the World Sailing Board and Yachting New Zealand's Olympic Committee. Because of her dedication, she was made a Companion of the New Zealand Order of Merit for services to governance in 2016. She's on the phone now to give us a few pointers and also to talk about the upcoming World Champs. Kia ora, Jan. We all have to start somewhere, but is it true that you started by driving trucks through university?
Yes, I didn't have a particularly good first year of university because I went from a sixth form. So I kind of lost what little fees bursary we had in those days and had to get a job. So I started driving trucks delivering timber for my father.
Oh my goodness.
It was hilarious. You'd pull up to building sites and the guys would say, oh, how fantastic. You're driving a truck. Can we help you unload the timber? Oh, of course. Yes, thank you very much.
So why governance? What attracted you to that path?
After spending as long as I did with KPMG, I really liked the variety and, the challenge of being able to add value to various different businesses and different challenges. So governance really was the logical step for me, and I love it.
And you have a background in, I think it's accounting, is that right?
That's right. I was with KPMG. I joined them in Canada on our OE and basically stayed with them for 30 years.
And if we're looking to go into this governance space, should we have a speciality? I mean, yours is in accounting, but is it okay to excel in law or communications?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the whole thing about a board is it's a group of people with different skills and opinions, and diversity is not just about gender or race or age. It's actually about the way you think, and different training and different life experiences teaches you to think and approach problems in a different way.
We've also been talking about quotas. The government indicated last year that they wanted 40% of women on boards for major sporting bodies by 2020. How's yachting and sailing coming along?
Well, Yachting New Zealand must be their poster child there, because 5 out of 9 on the current board are women.
Fantastic.
So that's more than 50%. But then Yachting New Zealand, actually, David Abercrombie and Greg Knowles and the team are doing a really good job. They recognise that keeping girls in sport after a certain age is difficult. So they've instituted a program and appointed a specific person to be responsible for trying to encourage girls to continue in sailing past the sort of 16, 17 years. Because one of the good things about sailing is you can do it for your whole life. We've got 80-year-olds sailing actively.
Toni Bruce, why is it, or have you done research into looking at girls and why they drop off at that 17 age group?
I think there's a range of different pressures. There's a change in body shape, change in interests. So And also there seems to be a sense that it's okay to be, quote unquote, a tomboy before puberty, but once you hit puberty, suddenly many girls that have been involved in studies have said that they're suddenly expected to behave differently. So it requires a bit more of them to say, actually, I'm really committed to being a sports person and I want to hold on to that identity.
We're talking with co-host Toni Bruce and Jan Dawson, who joins us on the line. Now, before we move on to talk more about yachting and sailing, Jan, what are some tips to running an efficient board meeting?
Well, I think you have to plan, obviously, but it's how you make sure that all the voices are heard throughout the meeting. So it's not a race to a timetable. By all means, you make sure you've got enough time for your agenda. And then, I've learned quite a lot from chairs that I've worked with about how to encourage people to participate and don't just let the ones that like to talk a lot to have the first say, manage it so that everybody has an opportunity to give an opinion and is encouraged and valued for that opinion.
Yes, we were just talking earlier about that value that we place on ourselves. From a woman in a high position in a sports governance role, what's your advice about putting value on ourselves and our skills?
There's been a lot of research done on the sort of different approach of men and women. I think that's probably changing as more and more women have careers and, actively participate in commercial and governance and business. And I think that if women really feel that they're not particularly having a point of view or their opinion's not valued, one of the things that really helped me is I read Sheryl Sandberg's book, which I think is quite famous now, called Lean In, which basically says, yes, you might feel like this, and guess what? Some blokes might feel like that as well. But how about just working out what your value is and what your point of view is, and then lean into the table and participate? If we sit back and don't participate, people won't value what you've got to say.
And that's also true for athletes as well. So what's the state of health of the sport at the moment, not only in New Zealand but globally?
I think it's pretty good. The IOC has come out and Thomas Bach's 2020 position was that there should be gender equality in sports. Now, some sports obviously will never be gender equal, like synchronised swimming. I don't think there's too many men doing that at the moment, but maybe they will. But certainly World Sailing has taken this on and said that we will have gender equality not just in the number of athletes, but also in the events that we propose. So for 2024 Paris, we have now got 3 fully male events, 3 fully female events, 4 mixed events. So that's our 10 events in total. And the mixed events are really interesting. The NACRA, which is the World Chancellor here in Auckland, that's our fully mixed crew and was fully mixed crew in Rio and was a really popular class.
And we head into Tokyo 2020. How are we tracking for that? And what's the realistic medal total for us in this sport next year?
You'll have to talk to David about that. David Abercrombie. We've still got some really good performers. Sam Meach does really well in the laser. Molly and Alex in the 49er are, usually round the top in their game. The 49er men will be interesting because while Pete and Blair have been at Team New Zealand, some of the younger crews have come up and are doing really well. NACRA, there's a possibility there. So, overall, I think I'm not going to promise anything, but hopefully it won't be zero. Funding does depend a little bit on not being zero.
Yes, I can just imagine. Jan, it's been a pleasure talking to you.
If I can just give a quick plug for the Sport New Zealand and also the NZOC, they've been doing a lot of mentoring programs for women in governance. I've mentored a couple of people through the NZOC women in governance scenario, and Sport New Zealand also does some really good work on mentoring people and women in particular to try and get them up to feel comfortable that they can add value. It's really just getting that comfort level up.
Jan Dawson, who sits on the World Sailing Board. Today's co-host is Toni Bruce. Toni, we've had some incredible leaders on the show today, and I count you among them. Why was sport academia the path for you?
Well, it certainly wasn't the path I thought I would be on. And I just listening to Jan's interview, I see some quite interesting overlaps with hers, because my very first paid job was a rousey in my dad's shearing gang. So I came out of a kind of rural country environment as well. But I've always loved writing. And so I decided to apply to do journalism at what's now AUT in Auckland. And I just loved journalism because I loved the immediacy of it. You know, you went out, you talked to someone, you wrote it up, it was in the paper the next day, which is starkly different to academic writing, where you write, you spend months preparing something, you send it out for review, and it comes back 2 or 3 times, and it can sometimes be a year.
Oh, wow.
Or 2 years from the time you've done the research to the time it kind of reaches the public. So that's why I like to keep my hand in journalism. It gives me that kind of immediate hit. But I went and did my OE, and I ended up working on summer camps in the States with underprivileged kids, and I also really loved that. And all the people I was working with were getting undergraduate degrees, so I thought I'd try to get into uni. So I applied to Otago. I had to wait till I was 21 and even then I was a special entry because I was not exactly a stellar high school student. I played sport. I didn't really do anything else. And then I just loved uni. I loved the learning. It sort of just everything kind of came together. So I still think I fell into academia accidentally. I didn't really intend to be an academic, but I just loved learning and thinking about sport, what it means to society, and I had great opportunities and great mentors, and doors kept opening, and 25 years later, here I am.
Toni Bruce is our co-host. Well, that's almost it for Fair Play, but we can't go without an update from the toilets at the Basin Reserve. Toni, I don't know if you have been following the ongoing conversation that we've been having around toilets here at Fair Play. Cricket season is in full swing, so I asked the Wellington City Council how the developments of the new toilets were going, and if they considered last month's guest, Dr. Rosalind Stanwell-Smith's research into the relevancy of urinals. Their response was, quote, "Our project team have run out of energy in terms of having to answer your questions." They'll also be bringing in temporary toilets, which will be trucked in for the major games over this summer. I think that response, Toni, means that I'm actually getting somewhere. Also, just last week was the UN World Toilet Day. For it, I wrote about this ongoing story, and you can find that on the Fair Play page on RNZ. The title of it is Toilet Equality Piss Poor.
Happy holidays from Wisp Sports.
Well, that's it for Fair Play. Thank you so much to all our wonderful guests who have joined us today. Thank you, Karen Skinner from New Zealand Rugby, New Zealand Football's Johanna Wood, Sally Morrison, Jan Dawson, and of course, Toni Bruce. It's a pleasure, and I hope that you come and join us again next year. We'll be bringing more questions about the toilets in the December episode of Fair Play, which will be out just before Christmas. And that's it. Thanks again to RNZ, Locker Room and Wisp Sports. I'm Zoe George. Don't forget to play hard, but play fair.